Why do the Jews and Arabs, two peoples with such ancient roots, continue to experience conflict? This rivalry, which has been ongoing for centuries, has deeper roots than one can imagine. The origin of this conflict is not just a matter of land or politics, but goes back to a family feud, a misunderstanding between two brothers who share the same blood. These two men are the sons of Abraham, and the history of their descendants forever demands that we understand that behind this rivalry, we need to go back thousands of years and observe how blessings and promises God made to Abraham shaped the paths of his sons, Isaac and Ishmael. On the one hand, Isaac, the son of the commoner, is the heir to the covenant with a great nation, the beginning of a history that determines the fate of two peoples and helps us understand how bonds of blood and faith turned into a conflict that continues to this day. Let's explore this ancient feud and discover how it has evolved over time. It all began with millennia of war, conflict, and dispute over sacred territory. But where does this rivalry between Jews and Arabs originate? To understand, we must go back to the very beginning, when everything began with a story of impossible love. The story of Isaac and Ishmael, sons of Abraham, brothers bound by blood, yet separated by blessings, is the tale of a rivalry that would change the fate of two great nations. Abraham was a man of unshakable faith, known throughout the earth for his dedication to one God. He and his wife Sarah were respected and known for their kindness and generosity, but faced great suffering, having no children. In a culture where lineage is important, the lack of an heir was a heavy burden, especially for Sarah, who carried the shame of unexplained infertility. Despite the pain, Abraham kept his faith. He believed that God had a purpose, and that somehow, his sacrifice would be rewarded. And indeed it was. Through Sarah, God blessed Abraham with Isaac, a son who would become the father of the Jewish people. Life will have a lasting impact, and so one ordinary day, God made him an unusual promise. Abraham would become the father of a great nation with descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the grains of sand on the shore. For Abraham, this promise was both a blessing and a mystery. How could an old man and elderly wife become a father? Many years have passed since that promise, but the expected miracle has not materialized. Nia and Avram, or Sarah, began to feel the weight of time and seemed empty of their promise. Faith was previously strong and confident, but it was weakening, giving way to disappointment. She looked at herself and saw signs of aging. Then Sarah came up with an idea in a culture where motherhood was valued and offspring were synonymous with blessing. Many women resorted to the common practice of that time, offering a maid for the birth of heirs instead of themselves. Sarah decided to offer Abraham the opportunity to have a child through a surrogate. This was a difficult decision, but she believed it was the best way to fulfill their promise and continue the legacy of their family. Together, they embarked on a journey to find a suitable surrogate and prepare for the arrival of their child. A child with Hagar, the Egyptian maidservant, may have been considered by Sarah as a way to fulfill God's promise. After reflecting on his wife's thoughts, Abraham agreed with this idea, and thus Hagar became the mother of Ishmael. The birth of Ishmael, Abraham's first child, brought a new dynamic to the family. Abraham felt joy and pride in his son, believing that he would be the promised heir. However, Sarah began to feel the weight of her decision to see Hagar as her maid, which she could not have imagined. Despite Hagar's smile and Abraham's affection for Ishmael, Sarah's bond with them only increased her bitterness. She now saw herself excluded from the role she had desired all her life. Fate, however, was preparing a new one, repeating the promise that she would have a son with Sarah, and this son would be the heir of the covenant. After hearing these words, Sarah laughed incredulously to herself, thinking, "I am such an old woman." Nevertheless, God's promise remained clear, and despite Sarah's initial doubts, she conceived and gave birth to a son. Isaac, the promised son, was born and brought with him a special blessing. Isaac's arrival should have been a cause for celebration, but instead, it brought tension and uncertainty. Little Isaac, beloved and protected by Abraham and Sarah, soon became the focus of attention. Although Abraham loved both his sons, he understood that God had a specific plan for Isaac. Sarah, on the other hand, became increasingly protective towards her son, as the presence of Ishmael and Hagar, now enjoying a higher position in the family, disturbed her deeply. The relationship between these two women became unbearable. In every look and gesture, Sarah saw a threat to Isaac's future. The initial discontent continued to grow. That disturbed the peace within the tent of Abraham. The culmination of the conflict occurred when Sarah saw Ishmael playing with Isaac. A simple act that should have been natural between brothers caused Sarah deep fear. She was afraid that, as Ishmael grew up, He would demand the birthright and threaten her son's position. Determined to protect Isaac at all costs, Sarah demanded the separation of Hagar and Ishmael. This demand was a shock to Abraham, who loved Ishmael and did not wish to part with him. However, Sarah was adamant that Ishmael should not share the legacy. Abraham found himself torn between his love for Ishmael and his responsibility to Isaac, his younger son. In his confusion, he sought divine guidance. God assured him not to fear fulfilling Sarah's request. Sarah would be Isaac's heir to the covenant, but God also promised Ishmael's blessing and the establishment of a great nation. Abraham's heart was heavy, but with a sense of divine purpose, he accepted God's plan. Comforted by a promise, Abraham prepared to say goodbye to Hagar and Ishmael. On a quiet and sad morning, he handed over the provisions to Hagar and watched her leave with the imam. The fate of both was uncertain, but Abraham believed that God would take care of them and keep his word. The separation between the two brothers marked the beginning of a separation that would echo through the ages. As Hagar and Ishmael set out into the desert, Abraham was left with a sense of heartache. He loved Isaac, the promised son, but he also felt the emptiness left by Ishmael, who, although far away, carried a blessing and his own promise with him in his absence. Isaac grew up as an undeniable heir surrounded by care and protection from Sarah and Abraham. Nevertheless, the memory of Ishmael persisted as a distant and quiet echo that did not fade. Hagar, alongside Ishmael, faced the challenges of the desert under relentless heat and the difficulties of survival. She watched her son grow up in conditions of scarcity, becoming steadfast and resolute despite difficulties. Hagar never forgot the divine promise that Ishmael would become the father of a great nation. This hope was what kept her strong even in the face of adversity. For Ishmael, the desert became his home and school, shaping his character in a unique way and preparing him for the role he would someday play. Meanwhile, the leader of the people was in the house of Abraham. Isaac grew up under the blessings of the promise and the careful supervision of his parents. He was taught to fear and honor God, to follow his father's ways, and to prepare for the legacy he would inherit. Abraham often told Isaac stories about their own experiences with God on earth, which would guarantee them offspring that would spread through the generations. These lessons shaped Isaac as a young man with strong faith and devotion to the values and responsibilities of his future path. However, the memory of Ishmael continued to live with Abraham in moments of reflection. He thought about his own and his children's ability to live in harmony with God as brothers. But the reality was that, although the divine promise connected both children with a majestic destiny, their paths were different. As time passed and Isaac grew older, he became more aware of the differences between his and Ishmael's paths. Despite this, he remained committed to the values that Abraham had instilled in him, and he continued to strive to lead his people towards a better future. A strong and wise man, Abraham, was growing old and saw in himself a reflection of God's promises. Over the years, the differences between the families of Isaac and Ishmael became more and more apparent. Although both brothers shared blood and spiritual heritage, Abraham's fate placed them on opposing paths. Isaac was the heir to the covenant established with Abraham, while Ishmael, although blessed, followed a different path away from the land promised to Abraham and his direct descendants after Sarah's death. Abraham sought to secure Isaac's future by arranging a marriage for him. Isaac married Rebekah, a young woman of faith who would soon become a central figure in the continuation of the family line. While Isaac was starting his married life and following in Abraham's footsteps, Ishmael strengthened his own position in the desert and became the patriarch of a tribe. Ishmael grew up to be a strong leader. Isaac, respected by his people, lived his life in the desert, shaped by the values of courage and independence. While Isaac was living in the Promised Land, Ishmael was traveling to other regions of Ur, creating a legacy in other lands. Years later, in a rare moment of reconciliation, Isaac and Ishmael met again, united in their grief for their father. At the funeral of their father, the two brothers stood side by side, united in honoring their father and saying goodbye to the one who had been the bridge between them. Despite the differences that had divided them, love and respect for their father prevailed. It was a quiet but significant moment, a pause against the backdrop of tensions that would one day divide their descendants. Over time, the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael would face the fate that God had promised Abraham. The promise given to Abraham would echo through the generations, shaping the destiny of his children. The beginning of Isaac and Ishmael is irreversible, and the promise of God will continue to be fulfilled through their descendants. Blessed with a divine promise, the beginning of the two powerful bloodlines that would shape the history of the region and influence the world took place. The people of Israel, descended from Isaac, established themselves with the construction of cities, temples, and rituals focused on the worship of God. In contrast, Arab tribes, descendants of Ismail, remained nomadic or semi-nomadic, ruled by their leaders and living in disparate communities, which increased the distance between them. Although both revered Abraham as a common ancestor, tensions arose over land ownership and territory definition. The descendants of Isaac saw Canaan as their promised inheritance and divine right, while Arab tribes sought to expand their territories. In the past, these conflicts were not great wars, but rather small clashes that reflected the underlying tension between two peoples who, despite their differences, shared an indissoluble link with the development of nations. These disputes extended beyond physical borders and were influenced by the blessings of God, who promised prosperity to both sons of Abraham and a source of pride and legitimacy for each nation. The descendants of Isaac viewed themselves as the chosen people, heirs to the divine, while the descendants of Ishmael revered their patriarch's independent and strong spirit, considering themselves also blessed and worthy of a significant legacy. Over the centuries, this rivalry evolved, acquiring new forms and dimensions. Each nation interpreted the promise of Abraham in its own way, creating narratives of legitimacy and law that eventually became the foundation of their beliefs. The descendants of Isaac, the land of promise, represented the embodiment of the covenant with God for the descendants of Ishmael, and their expansion symbolized their common prosperity. The story of Isaac and Ishmael transcends the boundaries of time, with consequences that resonate to this day. Two brothers united by blood and blessing of Abraham, but separated by the promise and different paths each chose. God's promise to Abraham was fulfilled in both sons, but in different ways, shaping their destinies and the fate of their descendants. For Isaacs, the land of promise became the center of identity, tangible in the desert, and in its expansion, the expression of blessing and prosperity. Each nation's identity was built around these elements: for one land, covenant, and for another, desert and freedom. Between Jews and Arabs, there is a lesson. Although there are significant differences, there is still recognition of a shared ancestry, which can be a pathway to a deeper understanding and perhaps a future in which promises and peace can coexist.